I was not. We had a different department dealing with enlargement. Yeah, we're starting dialogue on arms control. It's already at the start very difficult because framing the issue
Is hard. Okay. And how is it with the, I mentioned the Central Asians. When I've gone to Bishkek, and I think, okay, they seem still to be the biggest cheerleaders that I see. Consul General from China.
Okay, nice to meet you. They're starting to react to
Thank you all for coming out midday to a discussion, the kind of smart talk that we at the EastWest Institute like to have, where we bring together people from different parts of New York, that diverse place, to talk about issues that are not just the issues that EastWest Institute deals with, but the issues in foreign policy and the means by which foreign policy is carried out that are very important to us. My name is Cameron Munter. I'm the president and CEO of the EastWest Institute. And with us today we have Ambassador Lamberto Zannier, who is the General Director of the OSCE. Now, we go back, Lamberto and I, to a time in 2008 when I was the American ambassador in Serbia, and he was the newly minted representative. I think the title was for Kosovo, right? Special representative. And he came to the American embassy, and this was shortly after, you may recall, our embassy was burned down, or burned, by a mob when Kosovo declared independence. So the guards at our embassy were particularly zealous, and they were not nice to Ambassador Zannier. And he let it be known, because he's diplomatic but he's very firm, he let it be known that that's not the way to treat a representative of the OSCE. So one of the famous stories that I get teased about was, as soon as I heard about this, I came storming down the stairs and tried on my hands and knees to convince Lamberto that yes, we did have a meeting and the guards are only doing their job. And after that, it's been uphill the whole way. We were able to work together at a time where I learned about his skills, his ability to communicate, his ability to be direct, but his ability to be sympathetic, all the things that have brought him in a later time to head the OSCE. He has been the Secretary General since 2011. From June 2008 to June 2011, he was, as we mentioned, the UN Special Representative for Kosovo and head of UNMIK in Kosovo. From 2002 to 2006, director of the Conflict Prevention Center of OSCE. And previous senior positions include permanent representative of Italy to the Executive Council of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. It's a mouthful. 2000 to 2002, chairperson in negotiations of the adaptation of the Treaty of Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, CFE, 1997 to 2000, and head of disarmament, arms control and cooperative security at NATO, 1991-1997. This is a man who not only knows multilateralism in all of these forms, but has lived it and has seen it transform over time. So I think what I hope he'll be able to do, and what I will hold his feet to the fire and hope he'll hold his feet to the fire, is to talk about multilateralism. Talk about, in the context that we're experiencing now with upheaval in the United States, in the definition of how diplomacy is carried out, in the definition of how diplomacy is carried out in Europe, and the definitions of what a state does and what the opportunities and the threats of supranational bodies provide, that I think we have someone here who is uniquely able not only to talk about what the OSCE as an organization can do and to adapt to the new ways of problem solving and dialogue that are arising, but who has seen the changes and the different contexts within which multilateralism has to work. I hope also that we have a chance to talk a little bit about the kind of multilateralism that happens even beyond the state-to-state multilateral context. That, of course, is where EastWest Institute comes in, because we not only do work in trying to prevent conflict between states, but we talk about different actors, whether it's the business community, the academics, the NGO sector, public and the press, trying to figure out how multilateral diplomacy has areas that are not simply extensions of groups of states that come together to try to solve problems. So what I'd like to do is give Ambassador Zannier, give Lamberto a chance to talk about a few topics that are on his mind these days. I have a couple things I'd like to add, and then we will make sure that all of you have a chance to engage with the expert, with the guy who knows about the future of multilateralism in the kind of geopolitics that we're experiencing today. So over to you, Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you for your nice words, first of all, and I think your putting me on the spot. You're creating pretty high level of expectations now. We are in as you all understand, a very complicated phase when it comes to international relations, and I would like to share with you some of my concerns, because at this point I think we have to talk about concerns from the perspective of my current job as the Secretary General of the OSCE. I was here at the Security Council where I presented a rather big picture of the situation in Europe. And I think we need to invest more in the tools that we have because they are probably the best way for us to try to bring order in a world that looks in many ways chaotic. First of all, 2 words about the OSCE, and sometimes if you look at Europe, there are a bunch of institutions operating, and sometimes there is confusion as to the roles. The OSCE is first of all a space. It's a broad space that includes everybody. At a time when there is emerging confrontation, the OSCE is the platform where everybody can express its own concerns. In that sense, it has maintained the nature of what was the precursor of the OSCE, the CSE, a political process that was bringing together East and West at a time when the confrontation of the Cold War was making it difficult to find a space for engagement. And the OSCE has evolved over time. During the 90s, it has developed operational tools. Field operations were present in many areas of Europe up to Central Asia, because we are the largest security regional organization. We have 57 participating states stretching from Canada to Siberia, and so we have a transatlantic dimension, but we also have a Eurasian dimension that we inherited with the demise of the Soviet Union. The OSCE is not a club of like-minded countries. In fact, so that's a distinctive feature with NATO. Like-mindedness even in NATO now becomes a bit of a, but the OSCE by definition brings together countries that have different assessments of security, different perceptions of what is going on, and potentially policies that may clash. So the idea is to bring them together around the table, to try to bring out the issues and find ways to address them and resolve them and solve them. One of the, I would say, perhaps the central issue on the agenda of the organization now, which is the crisis in and around Ukraine, proves in a way this point, that the OSCE is the organization that managed, both at the political level, to find a space for an engagement with all the sides, and operationally to bring in everybody on the ground in what turned out to be the largest OSCE operation, which is the operation that we are running in Donbass now, the special monitoring mission in Ukraine. Not only in Donbass, covering the whole of Ukraine, but especially focusing on the situation there. So I think that is the feature. The method is trying to work on preventing conflict as much as possible, and with a concept of security that is very broad, looking not only at the military side of it, but also broadening it to also include the economic challenges, what we call the human dimension, so the promotion of human rights, stable societies, the notion create stabilities within countries, and stable countries then contribute to regional stability. In this moment, as I was saying, we have particularly an accumulation of challenges in front of us. We've seen a return of geopolitics. So with increasing confrontation within the organization, to the point that what is the strongest tool that we have, which is the dialogue, even that is becoming difficult. And countries sometimes spend too much time accusing each other of what's happening, rather than sitting back, looking at the situation and trying to find areas where some progress may be possible. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to invest in revitalizing dialogue. For this, I created also spaces slightly outside the, how can I say, the formal interaction among governments. I created something we call the Security Days, where we engage also with different actors, going a little bit in the direction of track 2, but involving the countries. So having a panel, but having the delegation sitting as the public and then interacting with the panel so that we can generate ideas and through that create a process of debate that is not really the classic intergovernmental process, but brings new elements on the table that can then start or help start debate when the situation becomes so complicated. At the same time, as we see that the return of geopolitics is making dialogue and negotiations more complicated, however, we see also the emergence of global challenges that affect everybody and where we need common responses. And that's the other problem we have, aligning the community of the countries that sit in the organization to develop policies to address these global challenges, whether this is terrorism, now violent extremism, or even climate change. So the agenda there is very broad, and it's very much also the agenda of the UN. So one of the things we've done, we have progressively positioned the organization under Chapter 8 of the Charter of the UN to act as a regional organization, as a regional actor to implement UN policies. And this is one of the reasons why I'm more often here in New York, and I'm looking at this kind of interaction with the United Nations. The new Secretary General, as I have to say, Ban Ki-moon was also very interested in this, but Gutierrez even more wants to invest in empowering regional organizations and using them also as tools to strengthen the ability of the UN to implement regionally its own policies. But for these, and coming back to this notion of Security Days, I will have one next month with mayors from across the OSCE region to discuss the problems of big cities. Having seen, also in the discussion of participating with the countries, which we still call participating states, we're halfway between a conference and an organization still in the OSCE, to show to the governments, who sometimes are reticent when we start the discussions on policy issues related to some of the trends that we see, some of the challenges that we see emerging. There is some resistance, hesitation, etc. And so the idea is to put them in front of the accomplishment of their own people on the ground, who have today to deal daily with these challenges, who have found their own solutions. We can present the solutions, have a debate among the mayors, but also between the mayors and the representatives of the governments. And that is one example of how we need to really start thinking out of the box, how we need to work not only at different levels of government, but also with different stakeholders. And we see for some of the programs we run on we operate on the ground, we start looking at private partners, because in the private sector we find increasingly actors that are interested in some of the things we do, and they want to support what we do because they see that they benefit from the results of our operation. For instance, we have a border management concept in the OSCE, and we do train border guards. And managing borders better is in the interest also of investors or people who work in trade, etc. So looking at how an international organization, by implementing its agenda in the field of security, as in the case of the OSCE, can also work to fight smuggling, for instance, or organized crime, etc., can be of interest of a number of other stakeholders. This has led also to us developing now a number of MOUs with different actors at different levels. So it is a completely new way in which we are now interpreting our role more broadly. But obviously, for some of the core issues, we need we should not lose sight of some of the key issues, and there. I have to return to the conflict, the crisis in and around Ukraine that was mentioned earlier, which is the culmination of, I have to say, trends that we have seen over a couple of decades, when we have seen after the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union, conflicts arising when the new borders came up. In the OSCE, in our jargon, we have a number of protracted conflicts. Georgia, Moldova, in the southern Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And most of these were, in fact, pointing to, how can I say, some unfinished work in the transition at the end of the post-Cold War, whose importance had been somehow ignored or underestimated. And so each of these conflicts was considered as a kind of a local accident. But the trends behind them were not taken enough into account. And now we see this in terms of the overall strategic relationship between Russia and the West. Russia, in fact, never fully felt comfortable in its post-Cold War skin. As the European and Euro-Atlantic institutions expanded, Russia lived this as a generally aggressive attitude towards itself. It became very defensive, and when countries at the periphery of Russia and in the former Soviet space started, how can I say, moving towards closer relationship with the Euro-Atlantic institution, and this is the case of all the countries I mentioned, Georgia, Moldova, and then Ukraine at some point, the reaction came, and then these conflicts arose. And so the issue of how also these strategic relationships should be handled in the future remains at the core of addressing these conflicts. Of course, what we see emerging is a problematic picture where Russia tries now to create in a way that is, how can I say, responding to the perception that the West has acted aggressively, to create a friendly space for itself through a number of initiatives, the establishment of a Eurasian Union, was the customs union in the initial phase, the establishment of a military alliance, the CSTO, new initiatives focused on how can I say, a more Asian-oriented balance of relations, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and we see a shift also in our activities in Central Asia. Central Asia is a very interesting region where we remain still very present with a number of field operations, and where Afghanistan remains a key question mark, factor of stability or instability. So investing on Afghanistan would remain essential also for the stability of that part of the world. One angle also in our activities has to do with the Mediterranean. We have a Mediterranean partnership. This has become particularly interesting now with the migration, but also cooperation with these countries in addressing some of the larger challenges, radicalization, and the issues relating around the so-called clash of civilizations. Or alliance of civilizations, if you want to put it in the positive side. So working to address these issues that are in a way affecting also the internal debate on our societies, and the impact of these new challenges as we related to the migration flows. In our societies in Europe is quite clear. We see emerging populism. We see a drift towards nationalism in many countries. There are now elections coming up in a number of major European countries. We had Brexit that it didn't affect the OSCE as such, but affects in a way the cohesiveness of Western European region in general, in geostrategic and geopolitical terms, I would say. And certainly This is something that we have to take very seriously. In all this, multilateralism, to come to the topic that Cameron was saying, and I will conclude on this, it is important that we do protect multilateralism also from, how can I say, if there is a tendency towards nationalism, the risk that also foreign policies become too renationalized. Multilateralism has brought with it the rules that have governed our relations over the last 60, 70 years, I would say. We have invested a lot in building a world that is obviously not perfect, where we do recognize mistakes, we do recognize the crisis, but we have a number of tools that we have developed over the time to address them and to try to avoid that they become uncontrolled. And all in all, this system has worked, and it has adapted over time, and it has served us well. And I think we should, first of all, reflect how we need to adjust further the tools that we have to this new, more complex situation, but also how to protect what we have from the risk that renationalization might create a much more difficult international environment where then the rules may at this point be decided, on a daily basis, and where there would really be a much higher level of risk for all of us. So I would leave it at that as an introductory, just set of considerations, and happy to.
Great. Well, let me thank you. I mean, one realizes that your remit, even though you're supposed to be looking at the world from Vladivostok to Vancouver, you're actually looking at everywhere, in as much as you talk about process and you talk about substance, that is basically looking at or reflecting the global difficulties we're having today. And so I had three quick things I wanted to mention. One is that when you listen to Ambassador Zannier talking about what OSCE does as an organization that is, in a sense, a representation of states, not an alliance, as he puts it, but as a place for dialogue. This is very much what EastWest Institute sees itself as, and I winced when he said, yes, we had the old East-West idea. That was in the old days. We, too, sometimes have to think that EastWest as an institution where we began, we were also from those times when we defined the old issues in different ways, but we like to think that as an institution we continue to grow. And just as we believe that there is not a world for diplomacy that's among states and a world that's out of states, but that it's a cooperation, an element of cooperation between, let's call ourselves a private organization, we're privately funded and we're independent and we're global. We see ourselves as partners in all of those areas where the OSCE is trying to find out how, not only to find dialogue, but how to define, to shape what the dialogue will be about and who is at the table. So I think it's an illustration to us that the nature of diplomacy and multilateral work is changing rapidly, and it's going to be up to us to make sure that we're relevant, that when in these forms that we've developed over time, that we're relevant to deal with the problems. A question I'd like to throw out for you, Mr. Ambassador, is, there is a model, you could say, that you have that has kind of grown from the Helsinki process, and there are parts of the world that are not covered by OSCE. We in EastWest have talked to people, say, in the Persian Gulf, who are not part of the OSCE process, who have looked at how you've been able to get people who don't always agree to come to the same table. People have talked about an OSCE of the Persian Gulf. People have talked about an OSCE that, as you mentioned, that deals with the problem of the integration of Afghanistan into the world of its neighbors following the devastation of 30 years of war. And I wonder if you could comment on what you think, not only of your efforts to try to be relevant, but your efforts to serve as a model for other areas. Can that be done? And then secondly, the question more in terms of content, maybe a little bit pointed, but you've talked about Russia, and Russia in a sense is a country, a key country in OSCE, and its efforts in one can argue that it is one of the leading forces for what we've called the renationalization of politics. Some would argue, that sounds like Mr. Trump, doesn't it, when I say some would argue. Some would argue that in order for Russia to achieve, or that Russian leaders might believe that in order for them to achieve their goals, they have to break down a system that they feel humiliated them after the end of the Cold War. How much, and let's say that this is something that would lead Russia to be critical of NATO, lead Russia to be critical of the European Union. How much would Russia want to say that OSCE is also part of that? Does Russia feel that OSCE is part of that process that made life difficult for them, that humiliated them? And inasmuch as, do you have to answer for yourself to say, we're part of that world that made you so angry? I mean, how does one come back to that? So the two questions I have, one is, how much are you a model as an organization for other parts of the world? What are your successes and failures? How applicable are you? And more specifically on the substance of dealing with Russia, are you seen as part of their problem?
Well, on the first, my reaction, first of all, I have to say that there are a number of countries that have reached out to us because they do see us as a model. We have, for instance, an Asian partnership, and there are countries like Korea, Japan, or even Thailand. We have Asia conferences in Asia every now and then, and it's really focused on this. How can we learn from the OSCE to try to do better our own, since we are not really very strong in regional cooperation in our part of the world, and we need to build better institutions. My answer to that is that we may be a model, but we are a model that has been developed by European countries. I think ownership, regional ownership, is key in this, and it has been designed taking into account the priorities and the visions of the countries, members of our organization. So I don't think this model can be as such moved to another part of the world. But it can show that there is a possibility to address problems and difficult problems in an inclusive framework. I think there are some concepts in the OSCE that are important. One is inclusivity. The second is the rule of consensus, which is sometimes, how can I say, misused in the OSCE. One point of the consensus rule is that we perhaps should try to qualify it and to have consensus for the important political issues in decision making, and not, apply it for every single organizational issue. But I think consensus is important because it protects the weaker countries in a way. And I've seen small countries really frustrating some of the bigger powers because they wouldn't accept things that they didn't like. And I think that's healthy in a way, and it's reassuring. But then on the important issues we manage. As I say, in Ukraine, we are present in Donbass with, now I have more than 700 monitors today in Donbass. And we are there with at the request of Ukraine, with the agreement of the United States, of Russia, of countries of the European Union, all the neighbors, and they all contribute to the operation. I think that's healthy. It gives legitimacy to what we do. And of course, we could try to do better, but those are also the difficulties, and if anybody is interested, we can talk about the difficulties of this kind of operations. But I think it's important. It's important that the regional community is present there and is trying to help, is trying to assist, and that's the signal we are bringing to the people in the ground, that we are there and trying as much as we can to help them sort out the problem. So others, if others really are interested in developing, say, in the Middle East, there is an interest. In my view, this should not be pushed from the outside. It should come from the countries concerned, but then we should be there to assist if they and to give them ideas, because we have a model that is more or less working, and so we can give them ideas on how and tell them how we did it. So sharing best practices, lessons learned, if you want, in the jargon we used. But so that should be the approach, and then why not? And maybe encouraging also them to move in the direction, but without interfering really, and letting them. On your question on Russia, I would say Russia is the fact that the relationships between Russia and some of the Western European institutions have become so problematic also depends on depends on both sides. It's the way they manage their respective relations, and I think there were opportunities that were missed over time in terms of building a stronger relationship between Russia and these institutions. The OSCE is different because Russia is a full part of the OSCE. If there are policies in the OSCE that we want to develop, Russia can stop them because they have the consensus applies also to Russia. So Russia is a key player, but is one of the many. And if it feels uncomfortable with the direction in which we are moving, the organization will not move in that direction. Having said that, especially in the phase of transition from the CSC to the OSCE, so during the 90s, immediately after the end of the Soviet Union, the West, I think, took over a little bit, and so the OSCE reflects certain sets of policies, certain sets of values that Russia tends to see now Western oriented or inspired, and so Russia wants a discussion on the basics, and would like actually Russians are asking for a charter. A charter for the OSCE, a founding document, to relook at Helsinki goes back to a different historical phase in a way, and refound the foundation of the organization in a way on this basis, and the West is resisting this because, especially the United States, I have to say, but a number of others. Because they fear that there may be a risk or erosion of some of the good things that we have in the organization. But this is where then there is a mismatch, and where there is a problem, where Russia feels a frustration because it feels that the organization is not entirely reflecting its own views, its own priorities, its own values, and so it distances a little bit Russia from at least certain aspects of the activities of the OSCE. One aspect of this is the difficulty now in appointing the heads of our institutions. We have a couple of institutions where the appointment process has been very complicated, and there's still the current chairmanship is still struggling to move forward in that.
Would you say that tends to be the third basket, that is the human rights basket, tends to be the area where that's the strongest? Yeah. Okay, well, I have plenty of questions, but I hope that you have questions as well, and I'll defer to some of you. Perhaps we can begin. Yes, please. Please identify yourself, if you would, and ask your question very clearly so we can hear it.
So my name is Papi Arroga. I'm from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I have a couple of questions on the multilateralism. Ambassador, do you think that actually it is there, but it has been captured by crony capitalism and nationalism within the multilateralism? And how do we go about actually freeing multilateralism from crony capitalism and taking resources from places and leaving behind very unhappy people, and creating space for people who promise that can bring that back but actually benefit from this disempowered, marginalized communities and conflicts that perpetuate themselves? And we know all over the world we have very little successes to show in terms of our approaches and success that we have managed. Second, what do you make out of the fact that Russia actually invaded Crimea only when the nuclear-free agreement was completed for Ukraine? So Russia was a good partner of NATO, was participating in the NATO processes, and then when this new re-emerging geopolitics and markets became possible because Ukraine was kind of unprotected, both by Europeans and Americans, and by themselves too, being completely sunk into the corruption and crisis of governance. Russia intervened, and that was in line of South Ossetia, Abkhazia, then the attempts of Russia to come back into the big at a world game. But there was a silence from the West about those things, even in Chechnya, and freedom of journalists and civil society in Russia. The voices were kind of weak from Europe and the United States to actually keep high the standards of democracy and principles and norms. And the last one, I want to ask you about refugees. Given that the international mechanisms are being obsolete, actually, to use Trump's word, when it comes to dealing with refugees. We're expecting 150 million people to move in the next 10 years because of climate change, because of local crisis. How do we bring back the international conventions and mechanisms, not only when they suit certain interests, but really fundamentally addressing the issue of people who are being both hostage and victims of the rearranging the interests in the world?
Thank you, Aki, and that was very clever to make that one question into three questions. So I do ask that people limit themselves to one in the future. But those are good questions, and I would ask Lamberto if he could address them.
Okay, well, the first one is not, it's not easy to answer. We are not operating in a virtual world. We're operating in the real one. So we can try to find ways around policies that you may consider, how can I say, biased or influenced by trends that are questionable. And we can do that in many ways. One of the things that we do in the OSCE is we really try to work with civil society as much as we can. We have many field operations, so we go down also. We don't limit our relationship with to governments, but we really go down at the grassroots level to understand ourselves some of the dynamics on the ground in countries where we operate, and factor that into our policies.
If I could break it on that, can you give one illustration of what that looks like? Do you have people who come out of your office and then go and just live with locals? Is it observers? What does that really look like on the ground, just as an example?
Yeah, our mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for instance, we have 10 field offices. So we're based in Sarajevo. We work with the government and we try to help make this country less dysfunctional. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done. But we're also present in many of the cantons, and we look at what is happening locally. We still see in many areas the concept of two schools under one roof, which sounds good, but is terrible, because you see students of one ethnicity, they enter the school and they turn right, and they learn history on certain books. Others from another ethnicity enter the same school, go left, and learn history on a different book that tells them slightly different things. And then when they come together, they disagree, because they've been, so we see elements that perpetuate divisions in the society. So you need to work at the local level to address some of the key issues, and that's the example that we try to stay out of a virtual reality and sort of, how can I say, larger designs, and try to touch with a finger the problems on the ground and address them in their own merit. So that is also a little bit the method for that. Crimea is a really complicated issue to address. We tried, the OSCE had an office in Simferopol in the 90s. And the Ukrainians told us, there's no problem in Crimea, you should come away from there. So we lost a bit of an early warning capacity ourselves when it came to the crisis. And of course, the way the whole Crimea thing is portrayed by Moscow is very different from the way it's portrayed by basically everybody else. But I would push back on your comment about acquiescence from the international community, because I can assure you that Crimea is mentioned, apart from the sanctions, of course, but is really at every meeting of the Council of the OSCE, the issue of Crimea is mentioned. It's very much on the agenda of the organization. The problem is how to address it and how to deal with it, because it's not easy, and it's for the Ukrainians to take the lead in finding a way beyond the issue of the management of relations between the West of Russia, where Crimea remains a very relevant and complicated and difficult part of the agenda. We had also, when I was mentioning the difficulty in appointing heads of the institutions, we had our institutions also issued a report on Crimea, and some of the heads of the institutions suffered from that report on Crimea in terms of their own also relationship with the Russian Federation. So it is a difficult issue to address. We tried. We have a mission that covers the whole of Ukraine, as I was saying earlier. I encouraged our monitors to go to Crimea, but they reached these checkpoints, and they couldn't get through, and so I went to report that we were not allowed to enter Crimea. So we are trying to use all the tools that we have to address it, but as I say, it's also a larger issue. On the refugees, we had an interesting. This is also an example of how we operate in the OSCE. We had a debate when the refugee crisis started, and it started hitting especially the Balkan route and hitting all the European media. And we started debating whether we should, from an OSCE, this turned immediately into a very complex debate in the European Union about quotas, the management of borders, etc. And I started saying we need to have a discussion in the OSCE, because there are many angles from which the OSCE is relevant. We have a border management concept in the OSCE. We have a special representative trafficking human beings. We have a ministerial decision on migration, on economic migration. We have our Office for Human Rights is following problems of the rights of the refugees and all that. We have the issue of impact on societies, the migrants, and the problems of marginalization that then leads to radicalization and violent extremism. So there are many, plus we have field operations that were reporting the impact of this transit in the Balkans, etc. So many angles, but there was no consensus, no agreement on addressing it. So I organized a security day. I organized it in Rome, and I told whoever wants to come, just join us. And I invited UNHCR, I invited IOM. The president of Macedonia wanted to come, of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. He wanted to come. And he addressed, I would say, quite a robust and critical intervention towards the role of the international community. And it was a really lively event for a day. After that, the chairmanship decided, well, it's a good point. And then a working group was set up. We had a meeting of the Permanent Council devoted only to the issue of migration and refugees. We had a ministerial decision, so this is now on the agenda of the organization. We're acting on it, but we're acting on it looking at the larger picture. So where is this going, and what are the key, the sources of the problem? We had Jeff Sachs at that conference on VideoLink, and he addressed some of these things. You mentioned yourself climate change, the demographic trends, economic differentials, conflict. So geopolitics make conflict resolution more difficult. The result is more refugees. Unfortunately, this is what we're seeing. So we need to address the geopolitical differences. If we manage to reduce them, this will help us solve conflicts more easily. Everything at the end is interconnected, and this is also the connection that we need to see.
Yeah, well, one thing that comes out of what I hear you saying is that refugees are the manifestation. They're not necessarily the issue themselves. The issues are climate change, the issues are governance, the issues are these things, and the refugees is what we see as a result. And so that in order to frame the question correctly, the OSCE contributes to a dialogue that doesn't just say, here are the refugees, but looks at the underlying causes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question I think we had in the front here.
My name is Britta Wagner. I'm the German Consul General here in New York. While you were mentioning other institutions, other international regional organizations in Europe, and I understand that the OSCE, because of its flexibility and the flexibility of its approach, has been able to overcome a difficult phase where it was not really important in what was going on, to find a new kind of approach to various, to a lot of problems and situations within its region. But there is another institution which goes further back, and there is a big overlap in membership and also in substance or topics. This is the Council of Europe. So I was just wondering, and the human dimension of the OSCE was mentioned, that this is sometimes one of the more difficult issues within the organizations and between participating countries. So what is your way of cooperating with the Council of Europe, making use of their expertise, and also of the legal groundwork that they have done?
Yeah, there is a very close interaction. In fact, we have mechanisms of institutional cooperation with the Council of Europe. The key differences are the OSCE is a security organization, whereas the Council of Europe is a human rights organization. So we come in a way from different directions, even though we sometimes operate in areas that are contiguous. The Council of Europe is also, as you mentioned, the custodian of a number of conventions and treaties, which we used as key parameters for our activities on the ground. So in fact, that's where also the synergies then are developed. In the OSCE is much more present compared to the Council of Europe, which is more of an headquarters organization. The OSCE is very present on the field, as I was mentioning, Bosnia earlier, or Kosovo, or in the Balkans. I was saying we have a big operation in Ukraine, but we have more people in the Balkans than we have in Ukraine. There's a lot of work to be done. And so in these areas, through these operations, we do in fact also bring in standards and we tailor our assistance towards facilitating countries implementing their commitments under Council of Europe conventions. And in some areas, in some others, we don't necessarily intervene. So also there, that's where we coordinate. And then, of course, the OSCE, one significant, and it's important to say it here, element in the OSCE is that the OSCE has, like NATO, a transatlantic link. So we are European, but also European in a geopolitical way, because we bring in the NATO constituency within the OSCE has always been very significant. So I wouldn't say that there is an overlap. In any case, I think it's better to have a bit more than not enough, in any case.
So it's an interesting idea that there's the problem that comes in a place like Japan or Korea where there are not the web of organizations. And then you think of an area like the Baltic Sea where I can't even count the number of international organizations, of which one is OSCE, that probably I would agree, better to have overlapping interests, better to have competing constituencies than to have none at all. And yes, they do have to separate out. Other questions, please. Well, if we have no more at this point, I have plenty, but please, we have this gentleman back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Stanislav, Russian Mission to the United Nations. Yesterday we had a briefing in the Security Council from Ambassador Kurz, who, among other things, briefed the Council about priorities for the chairship period. And in those priorities, one of the key was to rebuild the trust among the OSCE members, which is very necessary. The question is, how do you think informal dialogues like this can help to rebuild the trust, and whether Russia can do something about rebuilding trust in that? And finally, Mr. Zannier, you know you're very welcome in Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure you know what to do to the flight to Moscow.
I'm aware of that. Thank you. Rebuilding trust, I think, is at the core of what we do. Promoting reconciliation is essential for us. It's really in the genes of the organization, in a way, to try to create a space for engagement in spite of the problems. And today we have an accumulation of problems that I would say is unprecedented. So this has become more difficult. Sometimes I myself complain when I see the interaction among the delegations in the institutional forum of the organization. There are too many statements and not enough dialogue. So that's why I try also to carve the space in the margins through the security days and other initiatives. I even created a network of academic organizations that look at the OSCE And there I bring together Russians, Americans, Europeans, but it's research institutes. So they do discuss issues and in a controversial manner. And sometimes I would like to see also the representatives of the governments to engage in that kind of space that is more informal. So we need to rebuild that and to find that. There is an initiative on the table that was launched by the German chairmanship last year, the so-called Steinmeier initiative. And it's starting next month. It will be a structured, open-ended, informal dialogue on the future of the Paul Mill tools of the organization, the CBMs, disarmament, etc. Relooking at what we have, seeing if we can redesign it. There isn't really a clear proposal on the table, but the idea is to begin with the brainstorming and the discussion about security perceptions. So what is going wrong? What has gone wrong? We are at a time when, after the end of the Cold War, this is the most difficult phase that we have in terms of relations within the OSCE space. And the tools that we have developed already at the time of the Cold War and then afterwards to address these kind of problems are not working very well anymore. They've lost effectiveness. We need to relook at them and to make them more, adjusted to the kind of challenges we are facing today. And I need a constructive engagement by everybody to address them. So while not dismissing the importance of addressing the divisions and addressing the conflict, but this shouldn't block everything else. We should find a space also to move forward. That's the challenge we are facing, and hopefully now we have indication of movement in that direction. We will have to see also the impact of elections on this, beginning with the recent one here, and see what will be the directives that will come and the policies that will come from the new U.S. administration, and whether that will be, in fact, in the direction of trying to help build a space for dialogue in this very complicated environment, or whether they decide to move in different directions. That will have an impact on the way we operate in future.
There was an interesting article that appeared this morning which created two notions of how states would see themselves, and one would be Lenin, as in not the politician Lenin, but the singer Lenin. John Lennon's idea, imagine there's no borders, or Bannon. And Bannon was, putting, a very sharp definition of what a culture does. And I think you're right in the middle of that discussion about where the borders end and how issues deal with them. And that leads me to a question that builds right on this, which is you, both OSCE and EWI, have a great interest in the specific problem of cybersecurity, and how cybersecurity is something that wasn't envisioned at the time of the Helsinki Founding Act, and indeed is something that is changing and coming so rapidly that very much the format of dialogue and the definition of issues is really on the cutting edge of trying to figure out how people can work together. Can you tell us somewhat about how you want to address, or how you're trying to address cybersecurity, how dialogue on cybersecurity can work, who are the players? How do you approach that problem, which is potentially something that all countries, all members of OSCE and beyond, realize is an issue we have to address?
Yeah, the issue of cybersecurity, in fact, has landed on the agenda of the organization already a few years back, and we have set up a working group to deal with that. This group has looked at various angles of this, and we see in the cyberspace increasingly the same risk of conflict and the crisis that we see in the physical space, and including hybrid conflicts, where you may have actors playing on their own account and taking initiatives that are difficult to, on which it's difficult to point the finger in one direction or another, and perhaps even more so in the cyberspace than it is in the real world. What we have done has been to establish, as I say, a working group that has operated for 2 or 3 years, chaired by the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. ambassador who left the organization at the beginning of this year, and now the Hungarian ambassador is taking on the chairmanship. This group has agreed on 2 sets of CBMs, confidence building measures, on cybersecurity. So this is not cyber defense. It's not about protecting the systems, as other organizations are working on this, or countries individually working on this. We look at the impact of a crisis in the cyberspace on relations between countries. So country A may think a country B is attacking it in the cyberspace, attacking institutions, attacking processes, elections. Now it's the latest trend. So what we have is now a system of steps, or a sequence of steps that can be taken, beginning from or with the dialogue among the countries that can explain the steps that have been put in place to either regulate cyberspace, or to prevent attacks, or to defend from attacks. So presenting the policies, the national policies. And then moving from there to a system where, in fact, we have set up a dedicated network that connects all the capitals of the countries of the OSCE, where confidential information can be circulated in relation to potential cyber attacks, so that the country can inform everybody else there is a cyber attack that is being conducted against, and then asking either for assistance or for clarifications, etc. And from there, a process of consultation, so a dialogue about the potential crisis that is starting around the cyber attack. The problem is that we have agreed on this. These measures are voluntary. Ministers at the last ministerial adopted declarations saying that they are committed to the implementation of this. Now I'm waiting to see who is going to activate this. And I see that whenever there is something, people tend to go to the media and announce publicly rather than quietly come and discuss it. But maybe that's something on which it is time to start reflecting, and on which perhaps we could start thinking of how to avoid aggravating the crisis by going very public, and maybe start dealing with it in a more.
So maybe I'll ask our staff, when you send a tweet out, say that you shouldn't send tweets, right? Right. But no. But the point here is also that you have a number of people. Look at your background. You have a number of people, and states traditionally have a number of people who understood the intricacies of, say, disarmament or nuclear weapons. Where do you get the expertise on cyber? Do you reach out to the business community? Do you reach out to technical experts? Do you have partnerships? Is this an example of how you are working outside of the realm of state to state?
Yeah, we are looking, and in fact we had events on cybersecurity where we brought in experts, where countries also are providing us expertise. This is actually an area where probably also governments need to re-equip themselves, because sometimes I have the impression when you talk to leaders about cybersecurity, they are not entirely up to speed on these issues. So I have now an in-house expertise, but we are also interacting with the experts and the private sector. And this is a sector that is an area of work for me, also internally, in rapid expansion. And I see the risks, etc. What I need to see is the response of the countries, and because otherwise it becomes a bit of a virtual exercise for me, operating with a number to put in place a system that in theory works well, but then is not used.
Another question, another comment. Back here, yes, please. Jennifer, where are you from?
UN.
UN?
Just with respect to sort of the long-term solutions that you mentioned with respect to the refugee crisis, what does that look like in practice to you? Is it more legal pathways to citizenship, more international sharing of a quota system? Is it more resources to conflict resolution in countries that are producing refugees? Like what would you like to see happen?
Well, yesterday I had a meeting with a special representative of the Secretary General of the UN to discuss migration and refugees. And first of all, in terms of policy, I really see a regional organization like the OSCE having to link up with the United Nations and assist implementing regional policies with the UN and in close cooperation with the UN, and so looking at the UN Compact and then seeing how this can be implemented in every region. But first of all, we need to provide an input from the UN from our region, because obviously the migration refugees issue has different connotation and different implication for every region, and can be seen in very different manners. So there is also a need for an engagement among regional organizations on this, and this is starting now, and this is something that I'm discussing with the UN. There isn't a simple answer to your question. I think the answer is in the engagement on the long-term strategies, like the Sustainable Development Strategy of the UN, which touches on many and all relevant issues, from climate to the conflict to development. So the answer has to be a long-term answer, and the short-term response has to be, in the case of refugees, is the response that is based on the obligations that countries have on the basis of the existing agreements, the humanitarian agreements that define already what are the obligations of the countries. Unfortunately, the OSCE, we had a debate on a decision on migration. There are still countries that push back on the notion of solidarity. I think the principle of solidarity should be there when you discuss all this. But it's not only a matter of focusing on the issue of quotas and the short-term response. I think that should be, in a way, not the place where there is the primary focus. The primary focus should be on the long-term policies, addressing the root causes of the problem and addressing the conflict. And in the short term, we need to see the leadership that is required to contribute to addressing the acute phase, the acute crisis that we're facing, but investing resources on the long-term solutions.
This would imply that the definition of security, OSCE, the definition of security is changing and growing to include more and more the elements of understanding development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's consensus about this, you'd say, in OSCE. Yeah. Please. Anyone else?
I'm not sure if there is consensus in the OSCE. That's my view.
Because on that issue, one thing I would like to ask you about is one of the debates that's come up in the United States, especially in the understanding of our own electoral process, and I believe that we can look at in Holland or we can look at in France or in Germany potentially in this coming year, is the question of understanding inequality. And inequality was not, in my recollection, something that one addressed at OSCE. It's not that it was found to be irrelevant, it just wasn't on the agenda. If this becomes what is seen in the broadest sense, inequality, whether it's the inequality between nations in trade relations or within nations, and as economies change, how do you use the tools and methods and traditions of OSCE to address an issue like inequality, or can you?
Yeah, I mean, the OSCE is probably not the best organization for this, but we cannot avoid, the OSCE has an economic dimension. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to reorient the economic dimension towards the development goals of the sustainable goals of the United Nations. Because I think that plugs well into the security, the broader concept of security that we have in the OSCE. So the issue of inequality will come in that context. But we don't have a tool how can I say, to single it out and address it, if not in the context of preventing crisis, and so looking at how inequalities, either in the societies or among countries, can themselves generate tensions that can then result into a conflict. So that would be the angle from my
So it
perspective.
shows both the possibilities and the limitations of traditional diplomacy.
Yes,
Yeah.
in a way, yes.
Yeah. Okay, last chance if you want to see about the man who knows everything about what multilateralism has been and can tell you what he thinks multilateralism will be. No? Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you, Lamberto, for explaining what you're doing. And I can only say from the bottom of my heart at EWI, good luck, because I think we're all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh. And thanks, and all those questions that you were going to think of, please have them over refreshments in the back, and we can have an informal discussion.